Alabama.
Madam President, I rise today to discuss a piece of legislation we may soon consider in this body called H.R. 1. H.R. 1 does not solve the problems currently facing our election system. It makes the problems worse. Democrats have labeled the bill For the People Act, but it really should be called For the Democrats Act. This partisan bill represents the largest federal power grab in decades, and that's saying a lot after Democrats rammed through a partisan $1.9 trillion stimulus bill just 2 weeks ago. The American people elected 50 Republican senators, but the Democrats are happy to cut out half the chamber and the millions of Americans we represent to get what they want. H.R. 1 would completely rewrite our election laws, hijacking power from the states and giving it to the federal government to dictate how our elections are run. This type of top-down approach is the opposite of our founding principles of self-government. Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution grants states the authority to manage their federal election processes. H.R. 1 would take that away. The changes to our free and federal elections that H.R. 1 proposes should concern every single American. This bill forces a one-size-fits-all election system on our country by federally mandating how states run their elections. This phrase, for the people, means allowing citizens to choose their own leaders and voting processes, not Washington dictating new rules of the game. Let's look at a few examples. H.R. 1 would prohibit states from requiring voters to show identification, photo ID or otherwise. Currently, 36 states have requirements where voters need to show ID to vote. Nearly 75% of states agree that that's a good idea to confirm you are who you say you are when you go to exercise one of the most important civic duties. But the point is, states get to decide. They get to decide the laws on their books. When it comes to managing their federal election processes, H.R. 1 would nix the law in those 36 states. H.R. 1 would also make same-day voter registration mandatory in all 50 states. There are obvious concerns with same-day registration and its potential to be abused. This concept isn't new. Many states have already had the opportunity to consider it and adopt it, or not, if they choose. But if H.R. 1 is enacted, it would overrule the laws and choices of 29 states who have already decided they don't want such a risky provision in their voting process. Additionally, the Democrats are using this bill to make all the worst practices of pandemic-era elections mandatory in all 50 states. Universal mail-in ballots, ballot harvesting, and the drop boxes, just to name a few. There may not be much we agree up here on Capitol Hill sometimes, but I think we all agree that the 2020 federal elections voting process were a complete disaster in some states. Many of the states that had the hardest time running their elections were the ones that adopted the same provisions in this bill. Normally, you seek to use best practices, but this bill adopts the worst practices and forces every state to use them. That's the opposite of how our labs of democracy, our 50 states, should work. Every state is different, with different populations, histories, challenges, opportunities. What works for Alabama may not work for California or Oklahoma or vice versa. State governments know the needs of their people and communities better than bureaucrats here in Washington, D.C. They have different laws, they have different rules, regulations, including when it comes to voting. The same goes for the counties within each state. Jefferson County, the most populous state in Alabama, is different from Greene County, the least populous. While the state sets broad parameters, county governments are given some flexibility to run elections in the way that is accountable and responsive to their people. H.R. 1 fails to recognize the difference in our states and counties. This bill is not for the people, it's not of the people or by the people. Americans want faith and trust in their elections. They want to feel confident in the process that works. H.R. 1 injects distrust into the process, and that's not what Americans want or need. Madam President, in H.R. 1, we have a bill that will make states' voting procedures more susceptible to fraud. There's more we could go into, and I'd say these provisions should be more than enough to sink this piece of legislation. It shouldn't be controversial to say that we should have robust protections against voter fraud. Some states certainly do a better job protecting against fraud than others, but ultimately that's up to the state to decide, not the federal government. The Democrats' repeated response in election fraud doesn't exist, but they only say this when it benefits them. They want to rewrite the rules of the game for all 50 states from Capitol Hill. I've been consistent on the question of voter fraud. I believe we need more integrity in our elections, not less. We as a country need to restore confidence in our electoral process. I've joined my colleagues in calling for a bipartisan commission to look into how we can make our elections more secure. But to completely throw away or outlaw many of the safeguards we would destroy that remaining confidence for generations to come. But maybe that's the point of H.R. 1, which is even more reason to oppose this bad bill. House Democrats are calling this bill the most important voting legislation since the Voting Rights Act in 1965. The Voting Rights Act was important, historic, and necessary. H.R. 1 is not. The Voting Rights Act guaranteed millions of Americans the right granted by our Constitution they were wrongfully denied to them for too long. It was also passed with a strong bipartisan majority in both chambers of Congress, despite Democrats' control of the presidency, the House, and the Senate. That bipartisan support showed the American people that folks from different backgrounds can come together to work out important issues. Any reform to the rules of the game must be bipartisan, just like they were with the Voting Rights Act. For one party to completely rewrite the rules will destroy the people's trust in our voting process and their trust in democracy. Madam President, I yield the floor.
The senior